Okay, I want to talk about Robert Herrick, and in particular, we're going to look at his poem "To the Virgins to Make Much of Time." So, Herrick is considered the Carpe Diem poet. He did a variety of different kinds of poems, as did Donne. But in particular, the Carpe Diem theme is something that he's very well known for. And that Carpe Diem, of course, just means seize the day. So, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time is probably the most famous Carpe Diem poem. And before I read through it, I just want to point out a few things that I want you to listen for. So, one of the really great things about this poem is that Herrick does some fun things with the meter, even though it's a very short poem. When you look at it, you can see it's 4 stanzas. Each stanza is a quatrain, right? So 4 stanzas, 4 lines each, for a total of 16 lines. The rhyme scheme is very simple. The odd lines within each stanza rhyme with one another. The even lines within a stanza rhyme with one another. So you get an A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H rhyme scheme. Very basic, very simple, but it works nicely. The other thing that you'll notice is if you count the beats per line, you'll get 8. It is, with very few exceptions, iambic, which means, you've got that iambic tetrameter meter throughout. So it's a little bit shorter line than what you get in a sonnet, right, by 2 beats per line, which just makes it a little snappier, a little quicker. But there's something else really interesting that Herrick does with the meter in this poem that gives it even more of a kind of sing-song feel to it. And that is, you will notice, if you count carefully, that the even lines don't have 8 beats, they have 7. And it is still iambic tetrameter. What's happened here is that the final stressed syllable of each of those even lines has been left off. So if you're looking at the iambic meter, it'll be iambic right to the end, and then where you should have not one extra, but you should have that final stressed syllable like you have in the odd lines, it's just not there. And that is consistent throughout the entire poem. That technique of leaving that final syllable off is called catalexis. And it just means that last syllable has been left off. And the other thing that you'll notice is that with only one exception, the odd lines that end with that stressed syllable all end with a single syllable word, which really gives it a sharp, stressed ending. While the even lines that end with those unstressed catalexis at the end are all multi-syllabic words. And there's an interesting effect to that, I think. And so I want you to pay attention in particular to the ends of those lines as I read the poem. Because what you end up with is that even though the rhyming is between line 1 and 3 and line 2 and 4, the way that Herrick has used the meter really sets you up with couplets as well. so that line 1 and 2 and line 3 and 4 really go well together. And so there's almost an interlacing that happens between the rhyming couplet and then the metrical couplet. And so there's this nice effect that you get. The other thing to pay attention to is that thematically, most of those lines that end with your stress are also positive lines. That is, just thematically, they're positive. Whereas those that end on the unstress are thematically negative. So they're representative of their stresses at the ends of the lines. So it's really interesting structure to look at. So I'm going to read the poem. I want you to listen for the things that I've talked about, and then we'll talk quickly about some of the imagery of the poem and what it means to be a Carpe Diem poem, although the poem itself is fairly easy to read and understand. I was more interested in talking to you about some of the metrical stuff. So, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer. But being spent, the worse and worse times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may, go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. I overemphasized it a little bit there, but you can hear the way those lines ramp up and then ramp down, and ramp up and ramp down. And it's a really interesting effect because it creates almost a conversational structure to it. It is very sing-song, but it also has this kind of kind of feel to it as you read it, which is really interesting, and I think overall helps to emphasize the point of the poem. And the point of the poem is, of course, to tell virgins to make better use of their time, and in particular sexually, right? That it is interesting because, of course, much of what we've read up to this point in the semester has focused on chastity and purity and virginity, female virginity in particular, as this ideal that's to be preserved, even to the extent, of course, of cloistering yourself or making an arrangement with your husband to abstain from sex or any of these sorts of things, and that if female virginity is to be won, it has to be won through something elaborate like courtly romance or chivalry. Here, now that we've reached enlightenment and somewhat stability in terms of religious stability that Elizabeth has brought, where it's more of a moderate religious environment. So you have certainly less puritanical influence in the post-Elizabeth world. Things like this are more acceptable, but it is again this sort of Enlightenment approach where what you have is a sort of reasoned intellectual argument saying there's not really a moral advantage to this, but look at the facts, right? And the facts are this, right? That time is flying, that the flower that is in bloom or smiles today, tomorrow will be dying, right? That's what the first stanza says. And of course, flowers, and in particular roses, and in particular rose buds, are long-standing sexual symbols, particularly for female sexuality, which is often referred to in terms of blooming or blossoming or flowers or those sorts of things. So he sets that tone and his argument in the first stanza. The second stanza, he goes to another depiction of the passage of time. It's no longer about the blooming of flowers. It's about the passing of the sun, right? That in a single day, but over the course of time as well, right? Yes, the sun gets higher. It seems like it's rising, and look at, we're reaching the peak of midday, and there's still so much time left. But the reality is, the higher in the sky the sun gets, the closer it is to setting, right? His argument then in the third stanza is that youth is the best time of life, right? That age is best, which is first. That you should use your youth. That you have more vigor and more vibrance and more energy and more life when you're young, your blood and warmth. But those will be spent. Spent one way or the other, right? As you age, and worse times still succeed the former. It doesn't matter what you do in your youth, age and death still come for you, right? You can preserve your chastity, you can preserve your virginity, you can live in piety, and all of these things, but what does it benefit you? Nothing. Those people still grow old and die as well, without having had the experiences that you could be having in your youth, right? So his closing argument then is, then be not coy. And the word coy today has kind of a playful sense, right? If a girl is coy, it means she kind of, bats her eyes, and it's sort of a flirtatious thing, right? And it's cute and whatever. But at the time, it had much more the sense of like frigid or something like this. That was like, don't be frigid. Use your time, right? Go while you can and marry. And maybe he means here to get married, or maybe he simply means, coupling. But his argument, though, is that you have to use your time. That's the carpe diem. Seize the day. Use your time. Now. In your youth, in the age that is best, while the glorious lamp of heaven is rising, while the flower is smiling, right? Don't wait till tomorrow. Why? Well, he says in the last two lines, for having lost but once your prime. That is, having moved past this age of youth. You can't ever go back. Right? You may forever tarry. In other words, this may be your chance now. You are thinking, I can preserve my virginity. There is status in this and fulfillment in this, and look at my chastity and the honor that it brings me and whatever else. But the point he's making is, you're going to wake up one day and the sun will have run its course. Your youth, your prime will be gone. The flower of your beauty and youth and sexuality that was blooming is no longer, and then you will forever tarry because you waited too long, and no one is going to want you. Right? Now that may sound a little harsh, but I mean, there's a reality in that, and and of course, if you wait too long, then you're simply dead, and then, yeah, I mean, at that point, it really is too late. But there does come a time, of course, when it's too late for childbearing. It's too late for these sorts of things. But the encouragement of the poem is, hey, why are you waiting? Right? The same end awaits everyone. And if there is a time to enjoy yourself, that time is now. Now, you may agree or disagree with that from a moral perspective, but it is an interesting shift for us from what we've seen in the past, with the exception of maybe Shakespeare or Chaucer, although it's debatable whether or not seizing the day is actually beneficial in Chaucer. Um, but this marks a distinction for us, and I think it's really interesting to look at. It's a very fun poem to read, and it's a good opportunity for you to look at some real technical work being done by a poet, because that catalexis is intentional. And to be able to do that, to be able to form lines that end with single-syllable words, multiple syllabic words, on the emphasis, with the catalexis, with the rhymes, it's all very difficult, right? And I think it's a great example of looking at the work that goes into even a very short poem like this one. Plus, you still have to be able to get all of that imagery in there, very nice and neat within each stanza. So really great poem. You'll see similar things when you look at the Julia poems that I assigned you to read. Those three poems, obviously they go together. They were written about the same woman, whether she was a real woman or just a muse of some kind. Not entirely sure, right? But you have Upon the Nipples of Julia's Breast, which is a really imagery heavy poem that uses images of red and white contrasting. So that's something when you read that one, you'll want to look at in particular, just the imagery, how you can use something as simple as a nipple, right? As a focus for a poem, and the different ways that you could construct the imagery of that is really quite interesting. Then you have the Night Piece to Julia, which is, a poem about essentially a booty call, right? And then Upon Julia's Clothes, which is a really short poem that sets up a structure that is a little different. If we look at Upon Julia's Clothes, you'll see it's set up just 2 3-line stanzas. That 3-line stanza is called a tercet. And you'll see that it has a slightly different effect when you're reading tercets than it does when you're reading couplets or quatrains. And so what I really want you to pay attention to in all of these poems, number one, the imagery. When you read those Julia pieces, look at the imagery. Herrick is so good at creating this visual imagery for you. And then I'm also interested in you just sort of paying attention to the different structures. Each of these poems has a different structure in terms of its the number of lines in each stanza, the way the rhyme scheme is set up, the play between longer and shorter lines is something that I want you to watch for. You don't have to be able to fully explain it with a lot of technical terms or anything like that, the way I would expect in an intro to poetry course or something like that. But as you read them, pay attention to the effect that those different things have. And if you find yourself responding to the poem in a particular way, see if you can explain that in terms of the structure. Is there something about the endings of the lines that makes the poem feel upbeat or energetic or happy or reserved somehow? Those are things that I just kind of want you to watch for as you read through and enjoy the poems, right? Just enjoy the fact that you're not reading something now that is explicitly about Christ, that is explicitly about heroics. All of a sudden, we're into something that feels much more modern and contemporary and familiar, and it really happened quickly, right? So that's something to pay attention to.